Hey everyone, I am absolutely delighted to be here with you today and my very special guest, Mr. Julian Treasure. And if you recognize Julian, it's probably because you are one of the many, many, many millions of people who have seen his various TED Talks, one of which, as of this interview, is actually the sixth most popular TED Talk on the TED website. And that's including James Veitch's talk on what happens when you apply to spam email, which is not really a talk, more of a comedy routine. So for all intents and purposes, we can actually say he's the fifth most popular TED Talk. Anyway, he's also the author of How to Be Heard, a book that just came out recently. And I am thrilled to have you here, Julian. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. Welcome.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Neil. Delighted to be here.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I am just as in full disclosure to everyone, we had planned this interview before everything took place in response to the tragic killing of George Floyd. And so the conversation is actually going to speak a great deal to the ways that we can address how we show up and how we relate to others in the bigger picture of all of this tumult and emotion. And for that reason, I feel an especially great deal of gratitude that the timing worked out, that we can benefit from Julian's insights in this way. So Julian, before we get into that, I was hoping, because Julian, for everyone who doesn't know Julian's work, he's a sound expert and does a lot of work with that. And that's a great deal of what his TED Talks as well as his book are about. And Julian, I was wondering if you could speak to how sound became such a significant part of your life and how it became such a defining element of your life's work and expertise.
Sure. Well, I'm an auditory person, and I think there are different people in the world with different senses at the forefront. You know, some people are very visual, some people are very tactile. For me, it's the ears. It always has been the ears. That's the way I relate to the world. So, you know, I'll say to you, how does that sound? I would never say, how does that look or how does that feel? And I'm also a musician. I've been playing the drums since I was 13 years old, I think, or 12 years old.
Yeah,
And I think musicians tend to listen to the world in a slightly different way to non-musicians, because if you're playing in a band or an orchestra, you've got to listen to a lot of different other instruments all at the same time. So you have a kind of gestalt listening. It's a multi-track listening. And it's a very attentive listening. If you're not listening to the rest of the players, you're not a good player. That's always the way it is. And so I took that listening, which developed over years and years. And when I sold my magazine publishing business, I really wanted to do something about the way the world sounded. It occurred to me that it was very noisy.
yeah,
Most of it didn't sound very nice. You know, the sound around us in cities is not necessarily very pleasant. Construction, transport, you know, all this kind of stuff. And you see people standing on street corners bellowing at each other next to somebody who's drilling. And I just think, why don't you move? But they don't. So we've kind of gone numb. And this
right.
is the phenomenon that really concerned me, that we've gone numb, deaf in a way to sound. We've become unconscious to the effects. So the first question I asked back in 2003 was, does sound really affect us? And lots of research, oh boy, yes, it does. We can talk about that if you like in a minute. And then the second question was, does it matter that this is going on? And yes, it seriously matters. And then my whole magazine publishing business had been working with brands, helping them to produce custom publications, you know, magazines that said interesting things about the brand or the universe they lived in.
Yeah,
And I thought, well, most of the sound around us is created by organizations. So maybe we need to help them to start listening. And that was the first part of the journey, really. And then along the way, I got more and more focused on the fact that, hey, organizations are just people. And what we're dealing with here is people not listening and
yeah,
making sound. So it's become like the exhaust gas of just activity. And that is not good for us. Unfortunately, nobody notices. There are no votes in sound. You know, you won't get a politician saying, vote for me, I'll make it quieter. It's
right.
not going to happen. So that was really the genesis of the thing, and listening to the world has become a passion for me. So I'm even more obsessed about it than I ever was before.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, like even looking at the politician reference you just made and whatnot, I'll make it quieter, and it doesn't exactly occur to most people that that would be a benefit that they would crave. And I suppose I've always related myself to being more of a visual person in terms of how I take in information and how I see the world. If we look at someone like Temple Grandin, she actually sees the world in pictures and is able to process information through a visual lens very consciously and deliberately in her case. And I operate under the assumption that a lot of people are like me in that way, that they think
Mm.
if they're to pick out a sense that they relate to most consciously, that it would be sight, it would be vision. And first of all, have you found that there is a disproportionate amount for one sense than the other, that there are fewer people who are conscious of and aware of sound as an important part of their experience? Or do you feel that it runs the gamut and there are lots of people who are very auditory like you in that way?
Oh, I think there are plenty of people, but as a proportion of the world's population, I'm pretty sure it's a minority. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to measure this accurately. Most people, in my experience, are primarily visual, and we become a very ocular culture. You know, when you
Yeah.
ask, think of design awards. They're all for how things look. How many design awards are there for how things sound? None,
Right.
as far as I know. Obviously, music is incredibly important in human experience. It's a vital part of being human. And there has never been a culture that's been discovered on this planet that hasn't got music. So it springs up naturally as part of being a human being. Nevertheless, music aside, a lot of the sound that we make is unconscious, undesigned, accidental, unpleasant, because we're not listening too carefully. And this is, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, I think.
Mhm.
Only 4,000 years ago, we invented writing. And before that, all human knowledge was passed down
True.
orally
Yeah.
in the way that Indian classical music still is. You know, if you want to learn the tabla in India, you sit at the feet of your master and he says, it goes da 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 da, and so forth. And you
Right.
learn it by rote, not written down. There's not a note of Indian classical music written down. Very different to our Western culture now, where, if you get bored with this, it's being recorded. You can check it later. Anyway, it's got a book. I'll check the book. There's always something you can do. The premium on careful listening went a long time ago when we started recording experience, and I don't think it's ever come back. So it is an issue, I think, that we need to improve our listening. And of course, it's not taught in schools. We teach reading and writing
Right.
avidly. It's a scandal if a child leaves school unable to read or write, but children leave school every year unable to use their voice effectively and never trained in that, this amazing instrument we all use that you're an expert in, and also unable to listen consciously, unaware of the importance of listening, and the way it plays out in determining our happiness, our effectiveness, and our well-being in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that winds up being to me a rather noteworthy place that we can then transition into this conversation about where we're finding ourselves right now.
Mm.
In that, obviously, I'll look to you to guide me through a greater understanding around this, but I imagine that the lack of emphasis we place on listening in this time perhaps to some degree informs some of the issues we're now facing. Or
Yeah.
I misspeak in that way, we've always faced, but that are being brought to light far more
Mm.
explicitly than ever
Mm.
before.
Yes. Yeah, in many ways. I gave a talk some years ago in Athens, the cradle of democracy, which was
Mhm.
called "The Sound of Democracy," and my basic thesis was that the sound of democracy is listening. It's silent listening, because without listening, it's impossible to understand other people. And
Yeah.
democracy, civil society, depends on our ability to live peacefully with next door to people with whom we disagree fundamentally. And if
Mm,
they're the majority, then things are done their way and we
right.
just have to accept it. Well, you can either sit there in seething resentment about the situation or become very antisocial if you're not listening, or you can listen to them. And even if you don't disagree with somebody, you can arrive at a place where you can say, all right, I don't agree with you, but I can understand how you got there and why you believe what you do.
Right.
That is a basic level of understanding and empathy, which is absolutely essential for any democratic society to work. And sadly, it's really gone by the wayside a lot in the last few years. I mean, I take a lot of responsibility as a Brit for this because we started this whole populist thing in
Mm,
the Brexit vote, where there was, just a huge amount of lying, outright lying by politicians. The
yeah.
normal rules seemed to get set aside, and it was, slandering each other and lying about numbers and so forth. And after that happened, of course, you got your dose of it in America. So, politicians go off endlessly and have talks. I wish they would go off and have listens
Mm,
instead. It would make the world an awful lot better. Now it's really, it's got to a stage where we're now into the politics of mudslinging. And you mentioned the word polarization. This is a slippery slope that we're on, a
yeah.
slippery slope of caricaturing people, of demonizing people, of depersonalizing people. And we all know what's at the end of that slope. It's totalitarianism, it's concentration camps, it's, if you disagree with me, I'll kill you. It's ISIS. That's the stuff that we don't want in our lives. And the answer is to listen and attempt to understand. I think there's a great quote from Barack Obama, your former president. He said, I like to listen to people, especially when I disagree with them. Now,
Right.
how many people is that true of in the current administrations of our countries?
Right. And that winds up being a very specific way to view the differences in former administrations and current administrations, in the sense that there did seem to be a greater likelihood of listening, even if not agreeing in the end. And would you say that, I mean, this is a tricky area, because like assigning correlation can be a bit dubious unless you happen to have specific research that backs it up. But from my layperson's perspective, it would seem that the lack of listening at the top has had a trickle down effect on the way the populace of our respective cultures is responding to each other right now. It seems like a fair assumption to make, but it's also still an assumption. Do you have any insights or
Yeah.
any information that suggests that that's actually true?
No, I mean, I don't want to get party political about this either. I mean,
Yeah.
I can disagree with any politician, but I will try to listen to them to understand why they believe what they believe and to respect the fact they've got a right to believe what they believe.
Yeah.
The issue is about one of the major human failings that we all share. This is natural for human beings. It's a kind of defense mechanism, and that is the desire to be right. And when that starts to dominate our relationships with other people, that becomes an issue. And
Yeah.
that's what we're seeing at the moment in politics in so many countries, not just yours and mine, but many, many countries around the world, where it becomes about making other people wrong. That's the easiest way to be right. If I can say you're wrong, then that makes me righter and I'm elevated. I'm putting you down. I'm raising myself up. I feel better about myself. My ego is, enhanced
Yeah.
because I'm righter than you.
Right.
And although it sounds very childish to do it that way, my goodness, when you look at the newspapers, the media, the blogs, the hatred and vitriol, the trolling, all of this stuff is about being right and making somebody else wrong. And there's a great quote from another American who I respect a great deal, Harville Hendricks.
Mm.
who's a former therapist who invented the wonderful Imago method.
Mm.
And he said, you can either be right or be in a relationship.
Nice.
I think there's a great
Nice.
deal of truth in that, you know. And he said, you can't curl up with being right at the end of the day. So, you know, I think it's something we need to watch out for. It's a very natural thing, but, you know, if it comes to dominate our relationships with other people, making them wrong, being right, then that's, again, a route to conflict, and, you know, conflict that can get very major and very unpleasant, as we've seen just in the last few weeks.
Do you feel that any of this, do you feel that your message or the way that you relate to that human need to be right, the way that we tend to respond to that need and all that, do you feel like anything from your perspective has changed very recently, that there's a way that you've shifted your focus or anything like that just because of the vitriol that's now taking place? Or is it really the exact same thing, just even that much more topical, given what's going on right now?
I think it's made me more passionate. You know, I've talked a lot, and in my book, I talk about the circular relationship between
Right.
speaking and listening, and the fact these two things are in balance. You know, if you want to be a great speaker, it's really important to be a good listener as well. It's very difficult, actually, I think, to be a powerful speaker if you're not listening to the people that you're speaking to. You can't empathize with them, you don't understand them, and so forth. You're just speaking at people in that scenario. But I think what's happened in the last few years has made me a lot more passionate about the listening part of the equation. And I would now say, you know, listening is the base of communication. It's the sine qua non. You know, it is essential to be able to listen in order to have communication, connection, intimacy, understanding. Speaking, you know, that's nice to be a great speaker,
Right.
but you know, we wouldn't be in a great world if everybody was brilliant orators and didn't listen to each other. It would be very noisy, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And so I think I've become, what's been happening is I've become more and more passionate about listening, and it's the thing that, as I said, we never teach it in schools because it's a silent skill. It's very
Yeah.
hard to teach. It's very hard to measure. It's very hard to test, and yet it's so important as a life skill. And as we're seeing now, when we have lots of people not listening, I mean, I think you know, the phrase "I can't breathe," which has been brought up a lot of times, you know,
Yeah.
was said multiple times in that hideous event,
Yes.
and nobody listened. You know, and it's the listening that's key. It's otherwise, what's the point in speaking? What's the point in free speech if nobody's listening? I can't see it. So I think the answer to your question is that I've become 10 times more passionate about listening and a bit less engaged in the important skill of speaking, perhaps.
And which is a really interesting conundrum to be in, because even as you say in your book, you make the observation yourself in that you have this one TED talk that has maybe 5 or 6 times the number of views on the TED website than the other. And that one is about being heard, whereas the one about listening has decidedly fewer views.
Yeah.
And does that mean that we have a challenge in front of us? Like, is there a gap to, I mean, it very numerically looks like it a gap to be bridged. Would you say that
Mm.
that's the case?
Yeah, I think so. I do think so. You know, the old adage, you have two ears and one mouth, and it's not really hammering home to people, is it? I
Yeah.
think most people are much keener to be heard than they are to listen. And so that, you know, the message I keep talking about and I keep trying to promote in all of the work that I do is that you cannot have one without the other. They are symbiotic, and it is really difficult to be heard if you're not interested in listening.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's such a primary aspect of all of this. And since this all happened, I've been teaching my following myself on the value of curiosity, which as we've discussed prior to our having this conversation, is an aspect of what you call conscious listening.
Mm,
Another thing I want to make sure I reference is something you write in the book, that conscious listening always creates understanding.
mm.
And with that in mind, I very much appreciate that you are becoming more passionate about the listening aspect of the work that you do. And my thought is that it could be very helpful. Like, I've just been teaching curiosity. I know that your framework is more expansive than just simply that. I'm not attached to what it is ultimately that we get to glean from your expertise in this context. I would just very much like to hear, in the larger realm of listening, of utilizing our two ears a bit more than we're perhaps using our mouth. Do you have a specific way you'd like us to think about this practically, like breaking down the construct, or a few specific takeaways that we could start doing? I went, for everyone's information, I was telling Julian before we started capturing our conversation, how just yet, as inspired by Julian's work on his website, juliantreasure.com, he has this little course that you can go through in these series of videos. And the first one is on the value of silence. And so I just, as a side note to everyone, I usually go on a walk each day by the beach where I live, and I'll take an audiobook. And yesterday I just did it without any audiobook at all, just to listen, just to hear the ocean tide and the whole thing. So I'm already telling everyone what your practicum is, but I would love to hear from you instead. I'm just excited about it because I feel it is something that people can start doing today. And what would be your thoughts on how we can start to do that, and how we can start making that a day-to-day part of our lives, both in relation to what's going on in the world right now and in general?
There are lots of exercises that I talk about in the book, and let's wheel a couple of them out, which would be helpful to people. Silence is a really good one. I mean, you've experienced that yourself. If not silence, then peace and quiet. And it's hard to get in a city. Maybe go and sit in your bedroom, which is normally the quietest room in where you live, and sit there quietly. A lot of people find it quite threatening because there's an old phrase: in the silence you meet yourself, and
Yeah.
maybe we don't all like doing that. So maybe we put on lots of sound and distractions and multi-stream and fast edit, input in order to not meet ourselves and not have that stillness. It's a very good exercise to do. And silence, of course, is your baseline. It's the baseline for all sound. And it's what makes sounds meaningful. The gaps between the words, the gaps between the notes. Without that, it's just a constant cacophony.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say seek silence a couple of times a day if you can. It recalibrates your ears, resets them. It's like a sorbet in a rich meal. It gives your ears a rest, and then you can start to listen afresh, because we do get dead and numb with noise around us all the time. There's a really good exercise that I created years ago, which I did in the TED Talk on listening, and I still think it's a very strong one for conversation. And, we're talking about conversation here, called rasa. And rasa is the Sanskrit word for juice.
Right.
And in this context, it stands for receive, appreciate, summarize, ask, which is 4 simple steps to, I think, much more effective communication. So receive is facing the person, eyes on the speaker, and paying attention. Now, it's amazing how often, somebody will be talking to us and we're like, yeah, no, I am listening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I really listening? No, I'm sending a text over here. I'm not actually listening to you. And if your feet are pointing out of the door, your body's trying to move out. It's,
There's a subconscious thing.
we all know how frustrating that's frustrating to talk to, isn't it? Well, don't do it to other people. If you're going to be in a conversation, it's an amazing gift to give to somebody your full attention. I think Scott Peck said, you cannot truly listen to another person and do anything else at the same time. And that's true. So it's a question of receive, that is focus, attend, listen. And then the appreciate is the little noises that we make much more face to face than we would in video conferencing. And that's an interesting aspect of video conferencing,
Right.
which has changed human communication a little bit. It's a slightly altered form of communication because you're not going like, oh, really? Oh, okay. You know, the little bobs of the head and raised eyebrows and so on. I mean, you're doing a little bit and I can see your reactions, but we don't do quite as much as we would if we were actually face to face. But the appreciate helps a lot. It oils conversation and it lets somebody know that you're still there, even though, you know, I tend to be quite still when I'm listening, and you know, I have to watch that because if I'm just sitting like this and you're talking to me, it gets intimidating after a while, and people go, "You're right," you know?
Yeah,
Or on the phone, if you don't say anything, people go, "You still there?" Even though you're
right.
listening intently.
Either a
So
drop call or they're really mad at us or something.
yeah, exactly. So it's really important to give some sort of indication of your state and your attention. That's the A, appreciate.
Hmm.
The S is summarize, and it's the word so, which is brutally abused these days. Started in your country, it's now over here in my country. So means therefore. Okay, so it's a logical sequence. So we've agreed this. Now
Hmm.
we can move on to that. And
Right.
I lost count of the conversations. What's your name? So I'm John. Okay, you're John because I just asked you? I don't understand that. Where's the logical sequence here? Now, there are even TED Talks, I mean, there are plenty of TED Talks, unfortunately, where people walk on stage and go, so what? You just walked on stage.
You feel about so the way
Therefore,
I feel about the misuse of the word literally.
oh, yes. Yeah, that's another great one. Absolutely. Yes, I'm literally exploding.
Like, okay.
So, yes, and I do use the word so advisedly here. So, summarizing is very, very powerful. I always talk about it as closing doors in the corridor of a conversation. So you're moving down the corridor of a conversation, and when you go, so this is what you said. Did I get you? And they go, yes. Okay, confirmed. Now move on to the next bit. It's a very, very important word, especially in meetings. If you don't have a so person in meetings, they can go round and round. And what do they say about meetings? Places where you take minutes and waste hours. So they can be like that without a so person, round and round and round. And the final A of rasa is ask, which very much plays into your current interest in curiosity.
Yeah.
Asking is so important. Asking questions at the beginning, through, and at the end as well. Ideally, open-ended questions: why, what, where, how, when, which, who. Questions which do not permit the answer yes or no. Questions which get you further into the conversation and which elicit more information and which start that process of to and fro and show somebody that you're interested. So questioning is absolutely crucial. So that's rasa. And when you think about rasa, and you think about the communication that we see around us a lot of the time in the world, you see how big the gulf is,
Mm,
how many occasions there are where people are talking at people and not interested in the response, or where people are not listening to people and doing one of a number of things, like, for example, what I call speech writing, which is while you're talking, this sort of inconvenient noise is going on in front of me. I am composing my next brilliant piece of
right. Just waiting for the
dialogue,
next
which
opportunity to say
you're
something.
really going to enjoy. Yeah, which tends to give rise to the anyway, non sequitur, which is very demeaning to the person who's talking. They can get pretty upset about that because it's, dismissing them as irrelevant. So that's not listening. Faux listening, doing something else, thinking about what you can have for lunch while this person's talking. That kind of thing, it's hugely, hugely common. Partial listening, the most common one of all now. Partial listening while you're preparing something. We are so obsessed with time, doing lots of things at once, getting everything packed in, that listening has to be done on top of
Mm,
lots of other activities a
yeah.
lot of the time. And it's kind of rare that we do rasa. So anybody who's watching this, after you've enjoyed this or listened to this, when you go back to your family, whenever that is, try paying attention to them and really, truly, truly listen. And that is such a gift. And you'll probably get a reaction like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
because they're not familiar with this. You're staring at me when I'm talking. What's going on? You know,
Where's your phone?
people are not used to
Why aren't you doing
it.
something else while we're speaking?
Absolutely, but it breaks my heart to see so often. You'll see families sitting around a meal table together. Everybody is like this, and there's no relationship there. I mean, I'm a big fan of Sherry Turkle's book Alone Together,
Mm.
and I think she's absolutely right that technology in many ways is driving us apart, and it's really having a negative effect on our listening.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm thinking about this entire thing, Julian, in the context of, to use your word earlier, the vitriol that's now taking place, that even people who are staunch supporters of equal rights and state Black Lives Matter and whatnot, what I found myself is that a lot of people expressing their perspective are incredibly hateful in their support of people of color, and that there's a tremendous amount of hate to those who apparently, or at least in their perception, don't support people of color, and so, or are, in their words, racist. And so I very much appreciate the value of a construct like rasa, because what it's really doing, even if, to go back to your earlier point of what you were speaking about in Athens, the value of civilized debate, the value of civilized, I think you called it civilized disagreement, perhaps, or
Hmm.
something like that.
Yep.
The larger theme there is that we can have a very different perspective from another person, and that doesn't mean we need to, that the only tool we have to right the wrongs of what we perceive to be the wrongs of this world is to go out and shame other people for their perspective, that we can actively and consciously listen to another person no matter how much we disagree. Because what I'm getting from this is that there's real healing in the kind of connections that take place in that. Would you say that's the case?
Mm. Yes, I mean, obviously, and for all of human history, the answer is love, is being loving and understanding. And those two things are non negotiable, really. And if you listen to other people, you can generate the understanding, the compassion, what Buddhists would call loving kindness, which is the opposite pole. It's the other side of the coin to judging, blaming, condemning, and being right and making somebody else fundamentally wrong. Because the moment you get into that relationship with somebody, you're able to castigate them and punish,
Yeah.
and whatever that may mean. It might mean trolling, it might mean shaming in public, it might mean attacking physically.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the way forward for humanity, is it? Because we have to live on the same planet with people with whom we disagree. And unless we're all going to wipe each other out until there's only a small group of people who totally agree with each other, that's not a future that we can all entertain. And I would say listening has never been more important as a skill. And we're seeing that day after day after day. I've seen some great, I mean, over here we get obviously small parts of the news from the USA, but I've seen some great people standing up for not looting, not using violence. So this is not about that. This is about love. This is about understanding. And how can we
Mhm.
demand love and understanding if we're performing in the way that the others are performing? It's always the way, isn't it? So, yes, one hopes that listening will prevail, and there is a lot of listening that needs to be done with the history of the last few hundred years, my country and your country, and hopefully it will get done. But I mean, if we ignore the listening, all we're going to have is conflict.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that you'll find many people who agree with that more than myself. I very much support the idea of exhibiting and consciously deciding to exhibit as much loving kindness as we can, even for those who seem to be perpetuating a very opposite message. And with that in mind, I very much want to show my appreciation of you, Julian, for taking the time out of your day to share these thoughts with us. And I very much share that hope with you as well. We've already mentioned your website, but I would love to very much for people to have every opportunity they can to find you and listen with their 2 ears to all of the amazing things that you have to say. Can we get a little more information on where to find you and what you would like us to explore as a next step in this work?
Well, very simple thing, really. The website is juliantreasure.com.
Mm-hmm.
Treasure, like Treasure Island, Julian with an A. And just stop by and drop your email address in, and what you'll get is the sequence of 5 little videos from me that Neil was talking about earlier, which is a short course in listening skills with 2 of the exercises we talked about, silence and rasa, and
Yes.
3 more, one of which is really, really important, listening positions or listening from. That's, slightly complicated, but it's very, very powerful because it's all about the understanding that your listening is unique, and therefore everybody else's listening is unique. And it is a grave mistake to think everybody listens like I do. They don't. And the corollary of that is that you're always speaking into a listening, and you need to ask yourself, what's the listening I'm speaking into? Because it won't be the same one as it was yesterday. Even with the same person, changes over time. So there's all that kind of stuff in there, and 5 little videos, absolutely free. I'd be delighted if you pop by and pick up on those. And then if you really want to go deeper, there's the book, of course, which Neil mentioned, How to Be Heard. Very proud, actually, because I'm an audio guy, I'm very proud that book, I made an audio version of it after I wrote it.
Yeah.
And it won best business audio book, both of the awards, the global ones, the Audi and the Sovas.
Oh,
So that was
congratulations.
thrilling. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. I was really chuffed about that. Recorded in a little studio here in Orkney off the north coast of Scotland, and that was great. So the book's there through the usual places, and then if you want to go deeper still, there's my 7-hour course, which is online and available. You can find out more about that on my website as well. So be delighted. This is important work. We
Yeah.
really do need to pay attention to these skills. And if, like most people, you missed out on them at school, it's never too late.
Beautiful. Well, on that note, I thank you again, Julian, for taking this time. And I very much look forward to exploring this work in my own personal life, including many more walks of silence in the future. All right, everyone.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you.
Absolutely. So take care, everyone. And always remember that you have one mouth, but 2 ears.